If God is male, then male is God. Mary Daly. All religions on the face of the earth degrade woman, and so long as woman accepts the position that they assigned her, her emancipation is impossible. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, The Woman's Bible. In the early 19th century, in what is now Poland, there was a young girl with curly hair. Her name was Ernestine Rose. One Sabbath, as she was trying to comb her curls, her father, a Jewish rabbi, entered the room and said, "Put down the comb, for you must not work on the Sabbath." The girl looked at him and replied, "Then I guess I'll ask God." She left the room and returned moments later, saying, "I asked God if this was a sin, but he didn't answer." Years later, in one of her speeches, Ernestine Rose would reflect, "Our life is short, and we cannot spare an hour from the human race, even for all the gods in creation." Hi everyone, this is Religiolog. Do you know who is called the first modern woman? Or who was the first woman in the world to run an Academy of Sciences? How about the first woman to write novels and plays in Arabic? Or the first woman to call for the awakening of women and the protection of their rights in the Arab world? Do you know who the first female Nobel laureate was? What about the first female professor at a university? Or what Islamic feminism is all about? And have you ever heard of the woman who wrote about the failure of Christianity or the one who wrote the Gospel of Atheism? We are going to talk about all of that in today's review. Unfortunately, many people don't realize that women played a huge role in the development of free thinking and secular ideas. Though their contributions are often overlooked, these women challenged religious norms and fought for rational thinking and personal freedoms. And in this video, I'm going to tell you about just a few such women, and later I'll have another video focusing on secular women from the 20th and 21st centuries. From this review, you'll learn about women who weren't necessarily atheists or completely free from superstition, but who stood out in their deeply patriarchal societies. These women pushed for education for girls and women and their intellectual independence. In doing so, they challenged many religious and social norms. Here are some of the sources I'll be using. And here are just a few of the women we'll be learning about in this review. More likely, you've never heard of some of them, even though their contribution to Freethought were huge. I've broken down my review into several parts. First, I'll look at women in the global south, outside of Western civilization, like in Egypt, India, and Latin America. Then we'll move on to the late European Middle Ages and the Renaissance. We'll talk about the heroines of Freethought during the French Enlightenment. And finally, we'll explore the great British freethinkers and reformers of the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, if we step away from the traditional history of Christianity, which often focuses on the great man, and take a look at the work of experts like Dana Robert or Gina Zurlo, we'll see that Christianity was actually a women's movement at its core and throughout the history. As they point out, in many parts of the world, up to 70 or even 80% of people actively involved in churches and missionary movements were women. In fact, it was women-led small groups and Bible study groups that played a huge role in spreading Christianity, especially in the global south. Yet their stories are mostly unrecorded. Why? Because their voices and opinions were often overlooked. They remain in the shadows of history. The same things happens with the voices of many freethinking women. Just try searching for information about them online and you'll quickly see how little attention this topic gets. But why is that? In my previous review on atheism and gender, I talked about some of the challenges women have faced throughout history. So it's no surprise that if even many Christian women's voices haven't been recorded, when it comes to non-religious women, there is even less information available. Plus, where we do have records, they mostly come from white, well-educated, wealthy women from Euro-American cultures. Unfortunately, we don't have many records about non-religious or non-superstitious women from Latin America, Africa, or Asia. I'll admit it was tough to find sources about this woman, but I did my best. For example, Jennifer Hecht, in her History of Doubt, mentions that there were women among the Greek and Roman followers of atheistic philosophy. There were probably many, but only a few names have survived. Also, records from the Inquisition show that many women not only rejected religion, but believed everything religion offered was sheer madness. In ancient Greece, as early as the 4th century BCE, we see examples of women rebelling against the patriarchal norms of society and claiming their power, at least in imagination. For instance, in Aristophanes' play Lysistrata, an Athenian woman unites women who were tired of endless wars and organizes a sex strike, where women from all Greek cities refuse to sleep with their husbands until the bloodshed ends. This way, here we see women who were expected to be silent and submissive in male-dominated society, but who are deciding to rise up and propose their own political solution. One of the most notable women of antiquity was Hypatia, who Jennifer Hecht calls the last secular philosopher of the ancient world. While she probably wasn't exactly an atheist in the modern sense, she's often associated with early secularism because of her non-religious approach to sciences and philosophy. Though I'll admit we don't know a lot about her, the 5th century historian Socrates Scholasticus wrote, "There was a woman at Alexandria named Hypatia, daughter of the philosopher Theon, who made such attainments in literature and science as to far surpass all the philosophers of her own time." She became head of the Platonist school at Alexandria in about 400 CE, where she taught mathematics and philosophy, focusing on Neoplatonism. She wrote the astronomical canon and other important works. Unfortunately, Hypatia's life ended in tragedy. According to the Byzantine encyclopedia Suda, she was brutally murdered by a mob in Alexandria, her body torn apart and scattered throughout the city. This was due to jealousy over her wisdom, especially in astronomy, and it happened in 415 CE. In the power struggles between religious and political factions, Hypatia found herself on the side of the weak. As Hecht points out, although not entirely, the age of philosophy ended there. Hypatia's father was the last director of the museum. After she was murdered, so many scholars left Alexandria that it marks the beginning of the end of Alexandria as a major center of ancient wisdom. A bribe saved the killers from persecution, and after Hypatia's murder, no non-Christian in the Roman Empire actively attempted to propagate secular philosophy. As I mentioned earlier, it's really important to show that women who challenged established social and religious systems aren't just a product of the Western world. In the Global South, we also find examples of women who, even if they weren't entirely free from magical thinking, pushed back against patriarchal systems, religious norms, and superstitions in their societies. These women contributed to religious skepticism and secular thought. They stood up for rational thinking, social reform, and independence. And even if their ideas were based on Christianity or Islam, they still challenged the religious institutions and the status quo of their time. For example, Murasaki Shikibu, a Japanese poet and writer of 10th, 11th century, gained recognition even when women had very little status in Japan at the time. Shikibu helped to think critically of the role of women in society, what inspired many to question traditional norms. Zhu Xin was a Chinese feminist and poet who tried to lead an uprising against the Qin dynasty, which, no surprise, led to her execution. In Shanghai, she founded a school for girls and in 1906 started publishing Chinese Woman, the first women's magazine in China. She encouraged women to become financially independent by pursuing education and professional training. She also fought against oppressive traditions like foot binding. Juana Inés de la Cruz was a major figure in 17th century Latin American literature. Not only was she a brilliant writer and philosopher, but she was also a fierce advocate for women's rights and education. As a nun in colonial Mexico, she took on both the Catholic Church and the patriarchal society around her. In her famous poem, Foolish Man, Juana criticized the double standards that men imposed on women. She passionately defended women's rights on formal education and argued that older women should hold positions of intellectual authority to educate and empower others. This stance put her in direct conflict with powerful men, including the Church, which condemned her and pressured her to stop her intellectual work. Despite this, her legacy as one of Latin America's first feminist thinker lives on. Today, she continues to inspire discussions about free speech, gender equality, and women's intellectual freedom. Manuela Sáenz was a Latin American revolutionary and the lover of Simón Bolívar, who saved his life. That's why he even called her liberator of the liberator. Manuela fought actively for the independence of her homeland from Spanish colonizers and became recognized as a feminist symbol of the 19th century wars of independence. She rejected the typical role of the submissive woman in Christian culture, where women were expected to stay at home and quietly obey men. Instead, she was known for challenging the status quo and wanted to elevate the role of women in society. Manuela challenged patriarchal norms at every stage of her life. She left a monastery, she left her husband for a lover, she fought in military battles, and became a political exile. She also wanted men to see women not just as wives and mothers, but as friends and comrades. Hermila Galinda Acosta was the first woman to run for office in Mexico. She was a strong advocate for radical reforms, fighting for women's rights to divorce, vote, and be elected. In 1915, she created a magazine called The Modern Woman, where she openly criticized the Catholic Church. In her speeches, she strongly opposed the Church, saying it was the biggest barrier to protecting women's rights in Mexico. According to her, the Church was holding back social progress and necessary reforms. Galinda was also known for pushing for mandatory education for Mexican schoolgirls in anatomy, hygiene, and physiology, so they could better understand and take control of their own bodies. And today Galinda is honored on Mexico's 1,000 peso banknote. Speaking of Eastern Europe, one of the most important figures of the Russian Enlightenment was Princess Ekaterina Dashkova. She was the director of the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg and the founder and first head of the Imperial Russian Academy. In fact, she became the first woman in the world to manage an Academy of Sciences. In Paris, she became close friends with thinkers like Diderot and Voltaire, and thanks to her friendship with Benjamin Franklin, she became the first woman accepted into the American Philosophical Society. Of course, Dashkova was influenced by her longtime friend, Empress Catherine the Great, who also was a big fan of the Enlightenment. Catherine corresponded with Voltaire and was influenced by French Enlightenment ideas. She even loved reading Pierre Bayle's Historical and Critical Dictionary, which I mentioned in this video. Her worldview was clearly different from the traditional Orthodox or Christian views of her time, and one time Catherine even ordered 100 complete sets of Voltaire's works, insisting that people must read them and this way free their minds from superstition. But anyone who knows Voltaire knows that he was a sharp critic of religion, and particularly Christianity. In fact, Catherine's court became famous for its open displays of godliness, and jokes about religion were common. Voltaire himself said about the Russian Empire, quote, "The entire court of the Russian Empire consists of deists," end quote. And as we discussed in previous videos, in those days, deism was often close to what we would now call atheism. It often meant they didn't believe in the gods of any religion. Another notable female freethinker was Countess Ekaterina Stroganova, a lady-in-waiting at court. While in Paris, she made connections with philosophers and encyclopedists and met Voltaire, whose work she admired. Stroganova was passionate about theater and art, and she became known for her intelligence and free-thinking attitude. In the Islamic world, there were also some remarkable women freethinkers, especially in the 20th century, but I'll talk about many of them in one of my next video reviews. Now I'd like to talk about the West African poet and writer Nana Asmau. She's considered one of the early pioneers of modern Islamic feminism in Africa because she strongly advocated for better literacy among Muslim women. She became known as a leading scholar in one of the most powerful Muslim states in West Africa. Around 1830, she founded a group of female teachers called judges who traveled throughout the caliphate to teach women in special schools. Even today, her poems are highly respected in Nigeria as an important part of the country's literary history. I actually plan to make a separate video about Islamic feminism, which really gained momentum in the 20th and 21st centuries. But for now, I'll just mention some of its roots. For example, Aisha Taimur was one of the first women's rights activists in Egypt. In her writings, she criticized male dominance and celebrated the intelligence and courage of women. Taimur played a big role in the socio-economic transformation of Egypt, where women began to realize that Islam had deprived them of many rights. She worked with other female intellectuals and activists to push for better education for women. Because of this, Taimur is often called the mother of Egyptian feminism. Another influential woman in the 19th century was Eugenie Lebrun, also known as Madame Rushdie. She was an Egyptian feminist, intellectual, and influential salon host. In her writings, she fought for the rights of Muslim women, especially in the justice system. She believed that Islam should not require women to cover their faces or isolate themselves from men, arguing that these practices were corruptions introduced by powerful men. Lebrun also believed society had a moral duty to provide women with education. Starting in 1890s, she hosted a weekly women's salon at her home where they discussed feminism, politics, art, Marxism, and different social issues. She was also close friend with Huda Sha'rawi, the famous Egyptian feminist and nationalist leader. It was Lebrun who inspired Sha'rawi to publicly remove her hijab, arguing that veiling was holding back the progress of Egyptian women. Huda Sha'rawi was also a pioneer of the Egyptian suffragist movement, a nationalist, and the founder of the Egyptian Feminist Union. She was outraged by all the restrictions placed on women and viewed traditional role of women in Egypt and their life in harem as a deeply backward system. So she began organizing lectures, encouraging women to leave their homes for the first time. She also convinced her supporters to raise money to help widows and poor women. In 1910, she opened a school for girls, focusing on academic subjects rather than just the everyday skills that were typically taught elsewhere. In 1922, after returning from the 9th Conference of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance Congress in Rome, Sha'rawi made a powerful statement. She publicly removed her veil, and this bold act became a landmark moment in the history of Egyptian feminism and inspired many women to follow her example. This way, Sha'rawi was a leader of the movement that pushed for reforms in laws affecting personal freedoms like marriage, divorce, and child custody. In Lebanon, there was another activist for women's rights, Zainab Fawaz. She was a writer, poet, and historian of famous women. Her novel, The Happy Ending, is considered the first Arabic novel written by a woman, and her play, Passion and Fidelity, is the first play in Arabic written by a woman. Fawaz's works focused on the importance of women's education and the need to expand their rights, arguing that without access to education and participation in science, politics, and decision-making, women would remain ignorant and oppressed. She called for new laws and values to guarantee women's rights in education and work and criticized the obligation for women to veil themselves. According to the Critical Reference Guide of Arab Women Writers, Fawaz was the first woman's voice calling for the women's awakening and defending their rights, humanity, and equality with men. While in Damascus, she also founded a literary salon. In addition to her journalistic work, Fawaz is best known for her book, The Book of Scattered Pearls, regarding categories of women, in which she compiled biographical details of 456 women and their achievements. Fawaz was fearless in criticizing the societal traditions of her time. She believed women should have the freedom to make their own decisions, and she worked hard to raise their self-esteem and confidence. And she was also known to be a strong supporter of Mustafa Kemal, one of Egypt's greatest activists, influenced by French intellectual thought. Fawaz even inspired him to begin addressing his speeches not just to men, but to ladies and gentlemen. In this way, she insisted that women not remain in the shadows, but recognized for their value and presence in society. Hamida Ahmed Javanshir was an Azerbaijani activist and one of the first enlightened women in Azerbaijan. Along with her husband Jalil, they published the satirical magazine Molla Nasreddin, which became the most influential satirical magazine in the Caucasus and Iran. It was read across the Muslim world from Morocco to East Asia, like in India. At the same time, the magazine tackled important issues like the oppression of women and boldly satirized religious practices. It called for a fight against ignorance and religious fanaticism. From 1931, the magazine was even called Al-Akhshiz, which translates as godless. In the 1930s, Hamida published her memoirs, Awake, where she shared the story of her 25-year struggle to keep the magazine going. She also talked about her efforts to improve life for the peasants in her village, Kahrizli, by introducing modern farming methods and medicine. She founded a school for girls and a weaving factory to promote gender equality in the village. For instance, in 1908, she established the first educational school in Azerbaijan where boys and girls studied together. Hamida was also a philanthropist, and during a smallpox epidemic, she bought vaccines and made sure the people of Kahrizli were vaccinated. Today, there is a house museum dedicated to her life and work in that small town. Begum Rokeya was a renowned Bengali writer and activist who fought for women's rights and freedoms. She is considered a pioneer of the feminist movement of Bengali and South Asia. Rokeya believed that men and women were intellectually equal, which was quite a controversial stance at that time. She strongly advocated for women's education, arguing that without it, women could never be free and independent from men. Rokeya founded a school for girls and went door to door convincing parents to send their daughters to school. In 1916, she also founded the Muslim Women's Association, which campaigned for women's education and employment. Throughout her life, she was an outspoken activist, participating in debates and conferences to promote women's rights and advocate for liberal reforms. In 1916, she also founded the Muslim Women's Association, which campaigned for women's education and employment. Throughout her life, she was an outspoken activist, participating in debates and conferences to promote women's rights and advocate for liberal reforms. In 1904, for instance, she said, "Whenever any woman tries to raise her head, weapons in the form of religions or holy scriptures strike her head. Men propagate those scriptures as God's commandments to subdue us in darkness. Those scriptures are nothing but systems constructed by man. The words we listen from male saints would be different if they were spoken by female saints. Religions only tighten the yoke of servitude around women and justify male domination over women." Another Indian freethinker was Sharifa Hamid Ali. She was the president of the All India Women's Conference in 1935 and one of the founders of the UN Commission on the Status of Women in 1947. She also played a key role in pushing for gender-inclusive language in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sharifa received a solid education, spoke 6 languages, and was a vocal advocate against gender oppression and the social divide between men and women. She spoke out against laws that limited women's rights and opportunities, and at various conferences she argued that girls should not be married off before the age of 18 and that they should receive a proper education before starting a family. Under the banner of liberal feminism, she worked to unite women from different religions like Islam, Sikhism, Hinduism, and from lower castes and classes. This way she thought globally and non-denominationally, insisting that regardless of country or religion, women and men should have equal rights and opportunities. So these were just a few examples of free-thinking women outside of Europe and the US. I want to emphasize that especially in their time and context, it wasn't common to openly reject religion. We don't know for sure how religious these women were. Many of them were likely religious in their own way, or they were more liberal about it, or maybe not religious at all, we don't know. But in any case, challenging religion too openly would have been considered too extreme in those times. What's important, though, is that these women resisted religious dogma and questioned social structures, many of which were supported by religious institutions. They promoted a secular rather than religious approach to solving problems, and they played a crucial role in laying the foundation for later secular movements and in challenging the religious status quo. Their contributions show that secularism and skepticism about religion weren't just movements limited to the global north or to man, but were also driven by courageous, freethought women around the world. Now let's move on to another chapter of this review where I'll talk about freethinking women in Europe. I want to start with Christine de Pizan, who is known as the first woman to have supported herself by writing. Christine was an Italian medieval writer, and her father served as a physician and astrologer at the court of the French king Charles V. Because of this, Christine had access to what was probably the largest library in Europe at that time, located in the Louvre. In 1405, she wrote her famous book, The Book of the City of Ladies, where she described a utopian society where men and women are equal, and where she argued that if girls were taught the natural sciences, they would learn just as thoroughly and understand the details of all the arts and sciences just as well as boys. Many modern scholars consider her works to be the beginning of the modern feminist movement. Moving into the 15th century, we have Cassandra Fedele, an Italian humanist and poet who also fought for women's right to education. She debated these topics and even spoke before the Venetian Senate to argue for higher education for women. Then there is the French princess Margaret of Navarre, who some people called the first modern woman. Her court became a center of free thinking during the Renaissance. Marguerite was a strong supporter of religious freedom and welcomed thinkers like Etienne Dolet and François Rabelais, both of whom were considered atheists for centuries. Again, I've shared about them in this video. So if you haven't seen this video, please find the link in the description. Another important figure was Marie de Gournay. She was a French writer and philosopher who strongly advocated for women's right to education. She was a very educated woman and became a teacher. Some of her notable works, for instance, include The Equality of Men and Women, published in 1622, and The Lady's Grievance, published in 1627. De Gournay also edited and published the works of Michel de Montaigne, the famous Renaissance philosopher. Marie first came across Montaigne's essays when she was just around 15 years old. She was so impressed by them that they later became friends. And later she even became the editor of his essays, writing the preface for the 1595 edition and editing other versions. And obviously, Marie de Gournay was known for her skepticism. For instance, as Hecht writes, after Christine de Pizan, she was one of the first successful professional women writers. She was a crucial figure in the history of Tao, and keen skeptic who lived a philosophical life, wrote about real-world problems, and also edited and introduced the essays, the magnum opus of Renaissance skepticism. Jennifer Hecht also mentions that at the end of the 17th century, there was a surge in the persecution and aggressive suppression of unbelief in Italy. The church began to silence not only hot blasphemy, but also materialist philosophy. For instance, in Pisa in 1670, Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici warned local scholars that ideas like atomism would no longer be tolerated. And the following years indeed saw many trials. In 1688, for instance, the authorities arrested 11 men and women accused of denying the existence of God, the afterlife, and the divinity of Christ. They believed instead that the world was eternal and could be explained by atomism. This way, all over Italy, trials for atheism and related issues became more common. For example, in Naples, a man named De Cristofaro spent 6 years in prison for teaching Lucretian atomism. These anti-atheist campaigns continued into the 1720s, and as Hecht notes, not surprisingly, science went north. In his emotional history of Tao, Alec Ryrie talks about women in the 17th and 18th centuries who questioned the existence of God and heaven. He describes them as being troubled by thoughts of atheism. Ryrie goes on to mention the struggles these women faced, trying to hold on to their faith. For example, he writes about a woman from London named Sarah White who experienced spiritual torment for 4 years in the 1640s. Her faith wavered, and she even attempted suicide several times, thinking that if I made away with myself, there was an end to my misery, and that there was no God, no heaven, and no hell. But the very fact that she had such thoughts convinced her that she was damned already, being an unbeliever. Another woman, Dionys Fitzerberg, told those caring for her that prayers were useless because there is no such thing as God. She openly denounced her former faith as mere delusions and but a dream. Ryrie also talks about a clergyman, Richard Baxter, who recalled how some women in his parish were afraid to speak about their doubts, but occasionally did. One woman confessed that she was anxious about her unbelief and thought she was the only one having such doubts. Another girl shared her fear that there was no God, saying, I thought my estate to be singular, and that I should hear books and ballads cried of me about the streets. Ryrie describes another woman, Mary Gunther, who thought that the Bible was untrue. At one point, she convinced herself that the Bible was deliberately created by those in power to deceive and manipulate people. Mary Springett was one more woman described by Ryrie. After her husband's death in 1644, she started to doubt her beliefs. She stopped her daily prayers, and her former piety now seemed to her mere hypocrisy. And she was ashamed that others still thought she was religious, and she even began to hate those who claimed to be. Mary wrote that instead of worshipping some idea of God we've created in our imagination, it would be much braver and more honest to admit that we are utterly ignorant in trying to figure out if there is a God or not. She decided, quote, I resolved in my heart I would be without a religion until the Lord manifestly taught me one. As Ryrie puts it, she had become a devout and expectant atheist. But in reality, it wasn't so much a denial of everything supernatural, as it was a question of the truthfulness of Christianity or religion in general. So, while it's still hard to say anyone back then was a complete materialist, we can see that by the 17th century, not just men, but many women were questioning their faith. And as Jennifer Hecht writes, records from the Inquisition show that some women didn't just express an unconventional worldview. They completely denied the existence of God and the afterlife. They openly ridiculed the church's authority and rejected key religious dogmas. And these women were seen as threats, not just for their personal beliefs, but because they represented a larger challenge to the church's power and religious norms. This way, the Inquisition trials give us insight into early forms of religious skepticism. But they also show the huge risks these women faced when they doubted or rejected the religious systems that controlled their lives. For many, this cost them their lives. That's why it's no surprise that most kept their doubts to themselves, because they had justified fear of being condemned. Annie Gaylor, the author of A Woman Without Superstition, explains that even Voltaire, with his privileged status, had to be very careful about what he said. He was afraid to openly express certain things, so just imagine how it was for women in his time. The punishment for atheism or blasphemy could often be death. For example, in 1766, Voltaire couldn't save a young man, Francois Labarre. He was tortured and executed for blasphemy. Today, many streets in French cities are named after him, and monuments have been built in his memory. But it's important to remember that even at the end of the 18th century, people could be beheaded for blasphemy. One can only imagine how difficult it must have been for free-thinking or even just unconventional women, who, according to the Bible and the Church, were expected to remain silent. For centuries, women were executed as witches for the most trivial things. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th century that it became safer to openly express anti-religious and materialistic ideas, though only in some parts of the world. So now I suggest we move on to the modern times and talk about free-thinking women in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. And when we think of the French Revolution, we often focus on the influential men at that period. But we tend to overlook the women who also played a crucial role. One such woman was Olympe de Gouges. She is best known for her Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. She wrote it in response to the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, aiming to highlight the rights of women. She famously stated, "A woman has the right to mount the scaffold. She must possess equally the right to mount the speaker's platform." In addition to advocating for women's rights, de Gouges addressed other contested issues such as the slave trade, divorce, marriage, children's rights, and more. She was one of the first to call for the rights to divorce and the abolition of religious marriage, proposing its replacement with the civil contract. She also championed the rights of illegitimate children, the establishment of maternity hospitals, and national workshops for the unemployed, and shelters for the homeless. Overall, in the history of the French Enlightenment, literary salons played a huge role. These were gatherings where intellectuals of the time met to discuss various ideas. But not many people know that these salons got started when a few upper-class women of early 18th century Paris sought to get an education in the new sciences and philosophies of the day. They couldn't do it in formal settings, so they started organizing dinner parties to educate themselves. They invited the most interesting scientists and writers to join the discussion. These salons' hostesses were influential women like the writer Claudine de Tassin, the Marquise de Lambert, Julie de Laspinasse, or Suzanne Necker. But it was Marie-Thérèse Jaffrine and her salon that truly made a mark on the Enlightenment. She became one of the leading women of that period. From 1750 to 1777, she hosted the most influential philosophers and encyclopedists in her salon. She held these meetings every week and even changed the dinner time to 1 p.m., so there would be more time for discussion afterward. She held a Monday salon for artists and a Wednesday salon for writers. And such events had a serious social and political influence, and the ideas discussed at the gatherings had a big impact on the history of free thought and the Enlightenment. Some Italians who returned from Paris even wrote that they had tried to meet on their own at home, but, quote, "There is no way to make Naples resemble Paris unless we find a woman to guide us, organize us, Geoffronize us." Of course, referring to Marie Geoffrin, which kind of really highlights the importance of these women in the intellectual culture of the Enlightenment. I also hope some of you remember when in my video review on atheism and gender, I mentioned a huge influence Clémence Royer had on skepticism and free thought in France, especially through her translation of Darwin's work. If not, please check out my earlier review, as I don't want to repeat myself here. But trust me, her contribution to the intellectual history of Europe was impressive. Another French woman who played a key role in freethinking, according to Mitchell Stevens in his book Imagine There Is No Heaven, was Marquise de Châtelet. She was a mathematician, physicist, and Voltaire's longtime lover and muse. De Châtelet is best known for translating Newton's work into French, and her translation is still considered the standard French version today. And she didn't just translate, she also added her own comments and helped Voltaire understand Newton's logic. In 1746, she became a member of the Bologna Academy of Sciences, which was a huge achievement for a woman back then. For comparison, women weren't even allowed into the Paris Academy of Sciences at that time. So Du Châtelet wasn't afraid to dive into important debates in physics, and Denis Diderot included some of her ideas in his famous encyclopedia, probably the most famous text of the French Enlightenment. So all this shows that it wasn't only men who contributed to the French Enlightenment. Women who challenged the status quo and found ways around the restrictions of their time also tried to make their voices heard. Take Marie Curie, for example. Her struggle for the chance to contribute to science is well known. If you are not familiar with her story, I highly recommend at least watching a movie about her life. Marie Skłodowska-Curie was a Polish scientist who became the first woman to win the Nobel Prize. In fact, she won it twice, once in 1903 for physics and again in 1911 for chemistry. She was also the first woman to become a professor at the University of Paris and the first woman to join the Paris Academy of Medicine.
Madame Curie.
But what is interesting, as Mitchell Stevens points out, at the wedding they did not have a religious ceremony. Both bride and groom were committed non-believers. Hecht even quotes Marie Curie, who said, "Pierre belonged to no religion and I did not practice any." In one of her letters, Stevens also mentions that she hinted at thinking that religious people have a limited state of mind. Now let me move from France to Britain. And of course I want to start with Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a deist and wrote the famous book A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. While Mary never openly expressed atheistic views, her husband was a well-known atheist, and so was their daughter, Mary Shelley, who wrote the famous science fiction novel Frankenstein. Wollstonecraft's radical ideas about women's rights inspired many free-thinking feminists for a century. In her book, she talks about reason hundreds of times and argues that a person can be called rational or virtuous if they obey any authority but that of reason. She believed that society should be based on reason and insisted that women aren't less intelligent than men, they just haven't had enough education. Mary was also furious that women were treated like mere ornaments to society or property to be traded in marriage. And it's important to clarify, as I've done in previous reviews, that in the 18th and 19th centuries, many people labeled themselves as deists. But this was also a form of free thinking and a protest against the traditional Abrahamic religions. Often being a deist was basically a synonym for what we now call atheism. For example, Nick Spencer talks about Richard Carlile, a famous agitator for the establishment of universal suffrage and freedom of the press. Carlile once said, "The words deism and atheism, upon my view of them, differ more in sound than in meaning." In his journal Republican, he wrote, "There is no such a God in existence as any man had preached, nor any kind of God." In the preface to his book, Carlyle also said, "I'm quite proud of being called a deist, materialist, or atheist, just as the idolaters please, so long as I'm distinguished from them." But interestingly, Spencer also mentions Eliza Sharples, Carlyle's common-law wife, who was one of the first women in England to lecture on freethinking and women's rights. In her writings and speeches, she was very critical of organized religion. She argued that Christianity spread superstition and limited human freedom and access to knowledge. She even challenged the Christian doctrine of original sin, proclaiming metaphorical Eve to be the personification of wisdom, of liberty, of resistance to tyranny, and the mother of human knowledge. She also said that when people try to understand God or the first cause, we have to admit that we really don't know anything about it. Using words like God or the first cause is just a way of covering up our ignorance. In criticizing Plato's mysticism, Thomas Jefferson once wrote, "Speaking of Plato, I will add that no writer, ancient or modern, has bewildered the world with more misleading influence than this renowned philosopher in ethics, in politics, and physics." In the later, to specify a single example, compare his views of the animal economy in his Timaeus with those of Mrs. Bryan in her Conversations on Chemistry, and weigh the science of the canonized philosopher against the good sense of the unassuming lady. But Plato's visions have furnished a basis for endless systems of mystical theology, and he is therefore all but adopted as a Christian saint. It is surely time for men to think for themselves and to throw off the authority of names so artificially magnified, but to return from this parenthesis. So who exactly did Thomas Jefferson mean when he mentioned the unassumed lady, Mrs. Bryan, and claimed her work was more brilliant than Plato's? He was referring to Margaret Bryan, a British schoolteacher and natural philosopher. She published Conversations on Chemistry and A Brief System of Astronomy, and she was known for teaching science to girls while holding secular views. Overall, if you are interested, I recommend checking out the timeline of women in science. Wikipedia has a list of several hundred women who've contributed to science throughout history. But for now, let's get back to the Freethought women of Britain. As Annie Gaylor mentions, Harriet Martineau is known as the first female sociologist and one of the first women to openly publish books under her real name. Back then, many women used male pseudonyms to get published, but Martineau became famous for translating volumes of Auguste Comte. She also completely rejected religion and believed that dogmatic faith made people narrow-minded and arrogant. In fact, she even expressed regret for ever having trusted religion or believed in an afterlife. As Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom we'll talk about later, recalled, Martineau once told her that the happiest day of her life was the day that she gave up the charge of her soul, and she agreed that the happiest period of her life had been since emerging from the shadows and superstitions of the old theologies. As a sociologist, Martineau developed key principles of observation, data collection, and error analysis, which helped advance sociology as a field. Her best-selling books made her financially independent, and over time she became a well-known advocate for abolition and women's rights. For instance, William Lloyd Garrison praised her, saying, "The service she rendered to the anti-slavery cause was inestimable." And Florence Nightingale wrote that Martineau was born to be a destroyer of slavery in whatever form and whatever place. So no surprise, Martineau strongly criticized the state of women's education. She advocated for women to stop being submissive and embrace their freedom as rational beings. She also believed that the ultimate goal should be philosophical atheism, and she argued that the Christian ideas of reward and punishment were just a form of pagan superstition. In support of secularism, she once stated, "In the present state of the religious world, secularism ought to flourish. What an amount of sin and woe might and would then be extinguished." In 1855, when she was diagnosed with a fatal heart disease, Martina wrote in her autobiography about how she expected to die. She compared the Christian approach to death with her own feelings, writing, "The case must be much otherwise with Christians. They can never be quite secure from the danger that their air-built castle shall dissolve at the last moment. I used to think and feel all this before I became emancipated from the superstition. But now the release is inexpressible comfort. I see that the dying desire and sink into death as into sleep." Philosopher Emma Martin was a devoted and outspoken proponent of atheism. Being influenced by Robert Owen's socialism, she gave up her faith and became a strong critic of Christianity and the Bible. She even wrote a pamphlet about her decision to leave Christianity, called A Few Reasons for Renouncing Christianity and Professing and Disseminating Infidel Opinions. In this work, she advocated for real social change. She wrote, "Religion with an upward glancing eye asks what there is above. Philosophy looks around her and seeks to make a happy home of earth." Therefore, she urged churches to better use their printing presses to spread knowledge, not just religious texts. Martin even co-founded an organization with George Holyoake, the man who invented the term secularism in 1851. They wanted to reduce the risk of getting arrested for blasphemy, but Martin was still arrested alongside Holyoake. Fortunately, while he was sent to prison for blasphemy, she was pardoned by the court. As John Gaskin explains in his chapter Woman Without Superstition, Martin took a very bold and even aggressive approach to challenge Christianity. For example, she strongly criticized the idea of prayer. She argued that since God is unchangeable, it's illogical to think that prayers could change his mind. She pointed out that after thousands of years of prayers with no answer, and with the kingdom of God still just a vague idea, why should anyone keep praying? At the same time, she was very consistent in her criticism. She'd first present the strongest arguments in favor of prayer, and then dismantle them, showing how illogical it was to believe in its power. And in her letters, Martin explained that she gave up her faith only after 12 years of practicing and studying Christianity. After thoroughly examining both the internal and external evidence supporting the religion, she decided to reject it and publicly announce her decision. In 1844, in her work The Hypocrite's Prayer, she wrote, "How strange it is that you regard the real evils of the present life as of less fearful moment than the contingencies of some future one. The people perish for want, and you cry, 'More churches.' They ask for bread, and you give them stones." But of course, the main focus of Martin wasn't just criticizing religion. She fought for women's rights and their financial independence. And with this goal in mind, she traveled around the country, giving public speeches to thousands of people and pushing for change. Another British thinker was the English writer Ouida. She was also known as an animal rights activist. She even owned about 30 dogs at one point. Ouida wrote more than 40 novels, along with children's books and essays. For example, Jack London once said that one of the reasons for his literary success was that he read one of Ouida's novels as a child. In her well-known essay, The Failure of Christianity, Ouida wrote, "Christianity is a formula. It is nothing more." In this essay, she criticized Christian churches for being unable to resist immorality or fight corruption, especially because they failed to protect the social rights of oppressed minorities. Then she accused Christianity of hypocrisy, pointing out how women were terrified for doing something as simple as sewing on the Sabbath, as if they were committing a crime. At the same time, she urged the Church to think about the many religious wars it had caused and the suffering that came with them. She also criticized the Inquisition and other atrocities carried out by Christians in the name of God. Ouida argued that in ancient cultures, death was faced with dignity, but Christianity had turned the idea of death into a monster. She said Christianity used death to scare children, filling their minds with fear of demons and other nonsense. Ouida concluded that Christianity had been cruel to our civilization, taking away our joy and fun and turning our natural passions into sins. She also accused Christianity of failing to bring about real changes in politics, economics, and laws to protect the vulnerable. Instead, it simply promised them salvation in the afterlife, and even this only if they followed the faith properly. Mary Evans, better known by her pen name George Eliot, was another important freethinker. She became one of the most popular authors of the Victorian era. Eliot often spent time with liberal theologians and agnostics such as David Strauss and Ludwig Feuerbach, who were highly critical of Christianity and known for their skepticism. Eliot was also known for translating works by atheists. In Nick Spencer's book, he frequently refers to the text that George Eliot translated. For example, in 1846, she anonymously published a translation of David Strauss's Life of Jesus. And if you know his work, you must remember that Strauss argued that beliefs about Jesus' divinity, his conception, resurrection, and ascension were just later inventions. He even tried to trace how these beliefs were influenced by Greek, Jewish, and Eastern thought. It seems likely that if Eliot translated his works, she wanted to spread these skeptical views. She also translated works by Spinoza, and what's important, in 1854 she published her translation of Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity. In this work, Feuerbach argued that it was man who created God in his own image, and not the other way around. Annie Gaylor shares a sad story about Eliot's early life. As a young girl, she was very religious and obedient to her family, but after being influenced by a friend, she began reading skeptical books and eventually lost her faith. As a teenager, she decided to stop going to church, which led to a serious argument with her father. In fact, he kicked her out of the house and made her live with her sister until she promised to reconsider her beliefs. And this painful episode had a lasting effect on her and became a theme in many of her works, that human relationships matter much more than religious dogmas. After Eliot's death, she was denied burial in Westminster Abbey because of her rejection of Christianity, and instead she was buried in Highgate Cemetery, in a section reserved for political and religious dissidents and agnostics. She was buried next to her common-law husband, the famous religious skeptic George Henry Lewis, and interestingly, Karl Marx and her friend Herbert Spencer are buried nearby. Annie Besant is another key figure in the history of Freethought. At 19, she married a preacher named Frank Besant, and they had 2 children. But as she started to have doubts about religion and refused to take communion, her husband kicked her out. They divorced, and after that she became a prominent speaker for both the National Secular Society and the Fabian Society, where people like Sidney and Bernard Shaw spoke. Besant eventually became a powerful activist and speaker, advocating for free thought, women's rights, secularism, birth control, and workers' rights. For example, she was involved in organizing the famous London Match Girls' strike of 1888, which had a huge impact on the fight for women's rights. Bernard Shaw even called her the greatest orator in England and possibly in Europe. Besant and Charles Bradlaugh, a leading British atheist, co-edited the National Reformer newspaper. They also wrote a pamphlet on birth control, which led to them being brought to trial. Together they published the Freethinkers textbook, where they accused Christianity of being against all national, civil, and social progress, and all improvements in the condition of the people. They argued that real progress was finally happening only because Christianity had begun to lose its power. As Mitchell Stevens from New York University explains, Besant couldn't accept the fact that so many innocent children suffered from incurable diseases and died. She wondered how could a God, if he existed, allow so much evil in the world. She was also frustrated by how theologians always defended their gods. When good things happened, they praised God, but when bad things occurred, they just said God works in mysterious ways. In 1876, Besant wrote the Gospel of Atheism, in which she said, "An atheist is one of the greatest titles. It is the order of merit of the world's heroes." In 1885, she and Charles Bradlaugh published a one-penny pamphlet called "Is Christianity a Success?" In this pamphlet, they talk about how the Japanese government sent agents to study Christianity. And after looking for all the pros and cons, they came to conclusion. They decided that Japan should stay away from Christianity. The report said that Christian countries had more dishonesty, drunkenness, poverty, and unhappiness than Japan. The pamphlet then made the point that for 1.5 millennia, Christianity had great power in the West, claiming it would bring salvation and solve problems, but when you really think about it, Christianity hasn't been a success. Besant wrote that in its earliest days, Christianity appealed to the most ignorant and the superstitious, finding its readiest disciples among the most childish-minded of the populace. And once it got power, the ignorance took over the Roman Empire. Education was no longer valued as a virtue, and Europe sunk into the Dark Ages. She also wrote that wherever Christianity spread, it brought wars, death, poverty, and even prostitution. She concluded that Christianity was the world's biggest failure. It made empty promises and turned poverty into a virtue. According to her, Christians were taught to accept poverty by being promised rewards in the afterlife. Then she asked, indeed, why should anyone try to solve the real problems in this world if they believe their God will destroy it anyway? And then Besant promised a new creed as an alternative to Christianity. She suggested a world without a God in heaven or a master on earth, where there would be no class divisions and the common good would be the highest law. In 1889, she was elected to the London School Board and started to reform local schools. She introduced free meals for poor students and free medical exams for all primary school children. She continued to fight for workers' and women's rights, organizing protests and demonstrations, but in 1890, after meeting Elena Blavatsky, Besant became interested in theosophy and spiritualism. She started visiting India, reading Hindu and Buddhist texts, and eventually became a leader of the Theosophical Society. She moved to India, got involved in Indian nationalism, and founded the All India Home Rule League in 1916. At the same time, her Gospel of Atheism and Freethinkers textbook were very popular among the intelligentsia in India and Sri Lanka. As Hecht noticed, she thus brought to India the doubt of the West and brought Eastern thought to the West. Anyways, of course, I could talk about many more women who influence skepticism and free thinking, but I'll stop here for now. After all, this review is already pretty long. That said, one of the most active women's movement in free thinking, which I haven't mentioned yet, was in America during the 19th century. So I've decided to dedicate a separate review to that topic. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and wait for the next review. I promise it will be just as fascinating. But before I finish, let's return to the name Hypatia. I began this video by talking about Hypatia of Alexandria, and I want to conclude with another free-thinking woman named after her, the daughter of Charles Bradlaugh. While her father was on trial, Hypatia took over his business. Along with Annie Besant, she kept fighting for women's rights. Hypatia studied inorganic chemistry and animal physiology at London University and later taught these subjects at the Hall of Science, sponsored by National Secular Society. She also campaigned against the death penalty, edited a complete edition of Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man and The Age of Reason, and even started a magazine called The Reformer, with the motto, "Heresy makes for progress." Hypatia was also good friends with Ernestine Rose, the girl with curly hair I mentioned at the start and who I'll talk about in the next review. When Hypatia's father, Charles Bradlaugh, died in 1891, rumors spread that he had converted to Christianity on his deathbed. Hypatia was reeled. She successfully sued one party and eventually published a pamphlet titled "Did Charles Bradlaugh Die an Atheist?" Also, after 40 years of public service, she was appointed Justice of the Peace for London, a role she held for 12 years, and when she died, her testament included a statement, quote, "Now, in my 78th year, being of sane mind, I declare without reserve or hesitation that I have no belief and never have had any belief in any of the religions which obsess and oppress the minds of millions of more or less unthinking people throughout the world." She also added, "Away with these gods and godlings. They are worse than useless. I take my stand by truth." Well, I'll allow myself to end here. Let me remind you that unfortunately there are many gaps in the history of freethinking women. Sadly, many brave women have remained unrecognized in history for their efforts. One of the reasons is that they were illiterate and simply were not able to describe their experience for future generations. Let me also remind you that I am not making any value judgments here about how good or bad or correct the arguments of those I mentioned in this review were. Of course, some of their views on religion may be limited, reductionist, especially if we consider not only Christianity or monotheistic religions, but think about all religious and spiritual traditions of the world. But I'm not going to argue now how relevant or correct their judgments about religion or the political or social issues of their societies were. Rather, the main point I wanted to convey is that it's important for us to remember that Freethought is not only a male phenomenon and not only a product of the recent Western tradition. Women have shown over a long period of time and in many different regions of the planet that they are capable of thinking critically about a wide range of issues. Many of them spoke out against the established traditions of a deeply patriarchal society, where women were not allowed to participate in education, science, politics, in many important social decisions, and were expected to silently obey men and look after the household. But these women fought against slavery, colonialism, and social injustice. They defended the rights of women, children, workers, and those in need. And well, I hope that the examples of those few brave women I mentioned in this video who challenged social and religious norms and went against the status quo will serve as a proof of how unfair society has been to women in the past. And unfortunately, in many parts of the world, women still have to defend their right to freedom of expression, freedom from domestic violence, freedom to dress as they wish, the right to education, the right to vote in elections, and many other rights and freedoms that don't allow them to feel like equal members of society on an equal basis with men. So, my friends, thank you all for watching till the end. Thank you for your support with likes and comments, and also to those who support me financially through donations and sponsorship. You inspire me and help this channel to flourish. I'll be grateful for new donations and sponsors. Please wait for my new reviews, and I wish you all peace and health wherever you are.